Before I begin, let me just say this. You won't believe what happened that night. It started with nothing more than a knock at my door, well past the time I usually turned in for bed. By the time the night ended, I found myself looking at Daniel, my student, in a way I never imagined. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't planned, but it was a moment that settled deep into my memory. A moment that left me thinking about life choices and the unexpected ways people can connect. By the way, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching us? I love seeing where everyone is from. It was close to 11, the kind of late hour when the house felt heavy with silence. The TV was off, the kettle sat cold, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My hair was pulled back in a loose clip, and I had already changed into the kind of comfortable clothes you don't let visitors see you in. A soft cotton t-shirt and wore lounge pants. I had just set down the book I'd been reading when the knock came. It startled me. At that hour, nobody knocked unless it was important. I walked to the door, my bare feet making soft pats against the hardwood. When I opened it, the porch light spilled across Daniel's face. He was standing there with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, looking hesitant, almost as if he'd been debating whether to even knock. "Daniel, is everything all right?" I asked, keeping my voice low, because somehow the quiet of the night demanded it. He nodded, then shook his head. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I couldn't stop thinking about something, and he stopped, his gaze dropping to the ground. I stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "It's cold out. Whatever it is, you can tell me inside." The air shifted when he stepped over the threshold. I don't know if it was the faint smell of the night air clinging to his clothes or just the fact that his presence at that hour felt different, more personal, more vulnerable. I gestured toward the kitchen. "Tea?" I asked, moving toward the kettle without waiting for an answer. "Sure," he said quietly, settling into one of the chairs and the small table. While the water heated, I glanced at him. His hair was slightly messy, like he'd run his hands through it on the way over. His jacket was unzipped, revealing a gray sweater that had seen better days. I knew him as a bright, sometimes reserved student, quick to listen, slow to speak. But there was something in his posture tonight that told me he had come with weight on his mind. "What's going on?" I finally asked, placing 2 mugs on the table. He hesitated, looking at the steam curling from the tea. I don't really know how to say it without sounding strange. "Try me," I said gently. He looked up, and for a moment his eyes held mine in a way they never had before. It wasn't bold exactly, but it carried a kind of steady earnestness. "You've helped me more than you know, and lately I've realized I see you differently. Not just as a teacher, not just as someone older who knows more, but as someone He stopped again, his hand wrapping tightly around his mug. I felt my breath slow. I wasn't shocked exactly, but there was an undeniable shift in the air between us. I leaned back slightly, giving him space. "Daniel," I began, not sure where I was going with it. He smiled faintly, almost apologetically. "I'm not expecting anything. I just needed to tell you. You've been this constant in my life, and it matters more than you think." The kettle clicked softly in the background. We sat there, each sipping tea, the night pressing in around us. Outside, the street light threw pale gold across the window pane. The whole scene felt suspended, as if time had slowed to make room for this moment. "I appreciate your honesty," I said finally. "That takes courage. But you should also know I've noticed things too. Little things. The way you listen, the way you care about what people say. It's rare." He looked relieved. Maybe because I hadn't brushed it off. Maybe because I hadn't lectured him. For the next hour we talked not about school, not about grades, but about life, his worries about the future. My stories of mistakes and lessons learned. At times our hands brushed across the table when reaching for his sugar or moving our cups, and though neither of us pulled away quickly, we didn't linger either. There was a quiet understanding, a respect for boundaries, yet an acknowledgement of the connection. When midnight crept closer, Daniel stood. "I should go," he said, his voice softer than before. I walked him to the door. The night air spilled in again, cool and fresh. For a moment he stood there looking like he might say something else, but instead he just gave a small nod. "Thank you for letting me come over," he said. "Anytime," I replied. And then he was gone, leaving me in the stillness of my kitchen, my tea cooling on the table, my thoughts far from where they'd been just an hour earlier. That night I didn't sleep right away. I sat at the window for a while, the porch light still on, wondering what paths in life bring people to such unexpected intersections, and whether some moments are meant to change us, even if we don't see the full picture right away. The morning after his visit, the light felt different in the house, as if the windows had been polished while I slept. I left the porch light on longer than usual, as though it were a lighthouse to a ship I wasn't sure would return. My kettle sang, and I realized I was standing with one slipper on, and one off, smiling at nothing in particular. I told myself it was simply the pleasant relief that follows a hard conversation, like releasing a breath you didn't know you're holding. But if I'm honest, there was something else. A subtle current in the air, the kind that nudges a wind chime when there is no wind at all. At school, I noticed everything I used to skim past. The clock above the whiteboard made a softer tick. The string of ivy winding along the classroom window had pushed another leaf into the light, and Daniel sat 2 rows back, focused, composed, the way he always tried to be. Our eyes met once just for a moment. He gave a small nod. I returned it with what I hoped was equal parts warmth and assurance. Neither of us tried to make more of it than that. I taught my lesson with the practiced ease of someone who has navigated many rooms, many years, many hearts, including my own. Yet under that ease was a new attention, a respectful alertness to how tenuous and tender honest words can be once they're out in the world. When class ended, he didn't linger, which was perhaps the kindest thing he could have done. We both needed to see if what we felt the night before would survive the plain light of day without being forced, without being fed. Some truths are like birds. If you clutch them, they go still and silent. But give them space and they return on their own terms. The week unfolded with its ordinary rhythms. I graded papers at my kitchen table, the lamp throwing a familiar amber patch across the wood, and thought of the way Daniel's fingers had wrapped around his tea mug. I checked my phone more than I meant to, then scolded myself for it, then forgave myself. A woman can be steady and still curious, grounded, and still pulled by a quiet tide. There's dignity in naming both. It was Thursday when the second knock came, not late enough to be alarming, but late enough to be private. I opened the door to the same hesitant figure, though this time his shoulders seemed less burdened. He held a small brown paper bag like a person carrying something fragile. "I brought something," he said, "and I can leave it if now is not a good time." "Come in," I said and stepped aside. "The kettle's already thinking about boiling." He smiled at that. He had the look of someone learning to trust his place in the room, not because it was promised but because it had been offered. He set the bag on the table and pulled out a loaf wrapped in parchment paper. "It's my grandmother's recipe," he explained, suddenly bashful. "Honey oat bread. I baked it this afternoon." I laughed quietly. "Then we're well matched because I made soup as if the whole town were coming over. We'll put the bread to work." While the soup warmed on the stove, we fell into the small, unremarkable choreography of 2 people sharing a kitchen. He found bowls and spoons without asking, as if a map of the place had settled lightly into his memory. I buttered the bread and we ate leaning on our elbows like conspirators in some soft, harmless plot to be fully present in our lives just for an evening. We did not talk about that first night right away. Instead, we started with unthreatening things. A book he'd found in a thrift store. A story I'd loved since I was young. The particular way autumn sunlight grazes the tops of trees and makes them look dignified even when they're shedding. The conversation had a carefulness to it, the way good music knows how to hold a note just long enough. But it also gained courage as it went, like a lantern, feeling its flame, and deciding not to be modest. At some point the air settled, and he looked at me with that same earnest steadiness I remembered. "I thought about what I said," he began. "I don't want it to complicate your life. I don't want it to complicate mine either. But I couldn't pretend it wasn't there." "It is there," I said. "And it deserves kindness. We'll give it that and we'll give each other that too. No rushing. No crossing lines that can't be uncrossed. Just tell the truth, and let it be what it is." He nodded, and something in his shoulders softened like a knot released. There are moments in a life when someone believes you not because they must, not because you've earned it conclusively, but because they've decided to. It makes you careful. It makes you brave. We moved to the living room after dinner, mugs in hand, a gentle quiet in the space that felt companionable rather than empty. Rain began to whisper against the windows, one of those quick passing showers, The weather sins to freshen the evening, and confirm that you are in fact inside. I pulled an old photo album from the shelf, the one I keep, because it reminds me that I have been many versions of myself and survived every one. He listened as I pointed to faces and named them. My mother in a red scarf on a windy pier. My best friend from college laughing so hard her eyes disappeared into crescent. Me at 25 compressing joy into one of those limited boxes cameras used to allow. He looked at the pictures like they mattered the way a careful reader looks at a line break and knows it's there for a reason. I put the album away and he sat forward, elbows on knees, not to make a move, not to close a distance, but to say he was there, and would remain so until the evening asked him to leave. "May I tell you something that scared me?" he asked. "You can tell me anything," I said. I thought if I told you how I felt, I would lose what I already had. The steadiness, the way you speak to me like I'm capable of more. It felt like a risk, and I don't have many of those in me to spare. "You didn't lose anything," I said, surprised to find my voice thickening. "You found more of it and you gave me something in return. Not the feeling itself, but the reminder that my life isn't finished, making room for new truths." The rain gentled. The house made the small settling noises of a place that has been lived in long enough to have its own habits. We moved our mugs to the coffee table. His hand brushed mine. Not a test, not a tease, an unadorned touch, human and decent, as if to make the abstract real for a brief, grounded moment. I didn't pull away. I also didn't fold into the gesture as if it meant more than it should. I let it be exactly what it was. One person telling another wordlessly that respect can carry warmth without claiming ownership. I rested my other hand over his, a simple cover like closing a book you finished because you want to remember the last sentence for a while before moving on. He breathed out a careful exhale. We stayed like that for perhaps 10 seconds, maybe less, and then the spell ended the way all good spells should, with someone remembering to be wise. I lifted my hand. He withdrew his. The room regained its edges. "You'll finish the course," I said. "We'll keep our conversations kind and honest. And when the term is over, we'll decide if the path opens or closes on its own." "That sounds right," he said, acceptance sitting easily on him. I walked him to the door, and we both paused, listening to the light drip of rain from the eaves. The porch smelled like damp earth and wet leaves. He put on his jacket, and I opened the umbrella that led by the shoe rack, pressing it into his hand. "Keep it," I said. "Bring it back when the sun comes out again." He laughed. "Is that a guarantee I'll be invited back?" "It's an invitation to keep the weather from deciding anything for us," I replied. He went down the steps into the soft rain, a neat circle of shelter above him, and glanced back with that look I had learned already, appreciative, careful, certain of his gratitude, uncertain of everything else. I watched until the street lamp made his silhouette a shadow of a shadow, and he was gone. In the slow days that followed, I did not narrate our moments in my head, as if they were scenes I had to perfect. I folded laundry and found a single sock that had lost its mate long ago. I sat at the piano and rediscovered a waltz I'd used to play. My fingers clumsy at first, then steadier, like old friends catching a rhythm in conversation. I took walks at dusk when the neighborhood stretched out its quiet, and I noticed things I had overlooked. A porch swing moving on its own, the scuffed corner of the mailbox that looked like a map, the smell of someone's stew winding into the cooling air. The world felt both grand and close, like a hand you can see the lines on. When Daniel returned the umbrella, the sun really was out. He stood in the doorway, dry, a little wind-blown, the umbrella neatly furled like a well-kept promise. We didn't need tea that day. We needed a walk. So we took one, careful in our stride, unhurried like people who have learned the value of pacing. We walked beneath trees, turning toward their quieter colors, past fences that had heard 1,000 human stories, and kept them without judgment, down to the little footbridge over the creek, where the water makes that contented sound as it squeezes past stone. He told me he'd started a journal again. I told him I'd started sleeping with the window slightly open. He asked about the waltz I'd been playing, and I hummed a few bars embarrassed, then let the embarrassment go because he meant no harm. We talked about endings that are also beginnings, the way a graduation isn't a finish line so much as a gate left open. On the way back, he said, "When you look ahead, what do you see?" I thought for a moment. "I see a room with 2 chairs and a table between them. Sometimes the table has tea, sometimes it has bread. Always it has space for whatever words might arrive. I see people who show up and people who leave. And I see myself standing, sitting, listening, speaking, staying kind when kindness costs a little, staying firm when that's the right mercy. I see a life that's still being honest with me. He nodded as though I had said something far more profound than I believed I had. I hope I learned to see like that, he said. You're already seeing, I replied. You came to a door. You knocked. That's a way of seeing. We reached my house and stood in the shade cast by the roof line. There was no need to make the afternoon more dramatic than it was. He gave me back the umbrella and I leaned it against the wall. Then he did something that surprised me more than the first knock had. He extended his hand like a gentleman in a photograph and waited. I took it, matching his quiet. We shook hands, not the brisk transactional shake you give to end a meeting, but the kind that recognizes a promise without naming it. He thanked me for the walk. I thanked him for the bread. He smiled and I watched him turn the corner, his posture unguarded, his pace easy. That night I returned to the piano and played the waltz again. I made mistakes in the same places and different ones too, and I laughed at myself and kept playing. The notes ventured out into the room like brave small animals that, finding no threat, dared to stay. When I finished, I let the last chord hang in the air, then fade. I washed the soup pot even though it didn't need it. I dried the mugs even though they already were. I set the umbrella beside the door in its usual place. I looked out at the porch light and turned it off, not out of reluctance but out of trust. If there's another knock, I will hear it. If there isn't, the quiet will be its own companion. The moment I'll never forget was not a single sentence spoken at midnight or a single touch on a rainlit evening. It was the accumulation of respectful pauses, carefully chosen words, and the brave simplicity of showing up without forcing an outcome. It was discovering at 47 that my heart still recognizes the difference between haste and honesty. It was learning that a late-night visit could turn into an early morning clarity, that growth can be tender, that boundaries can be generous, and that sometimes the most memorable part of a connection is not what leaps forward, but what breathes and waits in lives. For a long time I believed certain doors in my life were permanently shut, their hinges rusted, their frames swollen with years of weather. I believed that was what maturity demanded. Acceptance without curiosity, steadiness without surprise. But now I think a truer maturity invites both the calm and the wonder. It knows how to hold a steady gaze and still be amazed. I poured myself one last cup of tea and stood by the window. The glass reflected a woman who hadn't become younger and didn't need to, who hadn't answered every question and didn't pretend to, who had at last remembered how to keep a chair open at the table inside her life. And there, for as long as the tea stayed warm, I let the quiet become the companion it had always wanted to.